everyone. Welcome to this bonus episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. I want to especially welcome new listeners. I am so glad that you found the show. This is the fourth bonus episode that I've put together. In the first three, I shared 3 new things that I've learned about Sargon of Akkad, Thutmose III, and Ramses II since I released their episodes. As with the previous bonus episodes, each of these is intended to sharpen the focus of the picture of the Great, and their life and their times, just a little bit. If you have not yet listened to the episode on Nebuchadnezzar, then don't worry. There are no huge spoilers in here, but I do hope that you will go back and listen. One unexpected outcome of doing this series is that I've come to feel a strange attachment to these historical figures. For some of them, I feel genuine affection. These are fun people to hang out with, so to speak. It's easy enough to imagine making an offering to a local god at the outset of a new conquest with Sargon, having a wide-ranging conversation about art, music, culture, and military strategy with Thutmose III, or going over the latest intelligence from the royal spy network with Darius I. As for Nebuchadnezzar, his is such an interesting and exotic name, one that I had certainly heard of before doing this episode. But aside from the name, all I had to go on was an impression of him as a exotic and somewhat volatile ruler. That's a big reason why I picked him for this series, to find out more. It turns out, he's even more interesting than I could have imagined. That's also why I just couldn't help myself, and have kept poking around to see what else I could turn up since his episode aired. So, here are 3 new things that I've learned about Nebuchadnezzar the Great since his episode aired a little while back. One is a fun little irony, one is a connection he shares with the subject of another bonus episode, and the last is how his reputation has changed over time. Okay, first thing. Our Nebuchadnezzar was named for his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar I, who was the first member of the family to rise to a high station. Ironically, this rise came from his appointment to be the governor of the vital Sumerian city of Uruk. He was put into this position by none other than our old friend the Assyrians. You will recall from his episodes that overthrowing the brutal Assyrians was the great project of the father-son duo of Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar. Thus, I have since learned, and find it wonderfully ironic, that his family's rise to prominence came from the patronage of those same Assyrians. Once he became king, Nabopolassar tried to shake off his unfavorable association by denying his lineage, claiming that he came from no one of consequence. His countrymen may have forgotten the role the Assyrians played in helping shape the family fortunes, but we can remember. Irony is always interesting, so that's number 1. Fun new thing number 2. There's a connection between Nebuchadnezzar and someone we met in the first episode. What is this, a crossover episode? Erica, what are you doing here? In his episode, I shared that before Nabopolassar's conquest against Assyria, he had introduced his son to spiritual and civic leadership by appointing him to be the chief priest at the Inanna temple in the city of Uruk, the same city to which Nebuchadnezzar had been appointed governor by the Assyrians. Uruk was, even by the standards of Near Eastern chronology, ancient, having been founded sometime around 5000 BCE. That's more than 7 millennia ago. It was one of the first urban centers in Mesopotamia and one of the cultural, commercial, and religious centers of the ancient world. Among other things, it was the seat of power of the legendary king Gilgamesh, most well known as the protagonist of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The tale is one of, if not the oldest epic tale that survives, having been written sometime around 2000 BCE. Among other noteworthy features, it preserves the story of a great flood, sent by the gods to punish the wickedness of mankind, the first appearance of this myth in history, predating the biblical account of Noah and the Great Flood by between 5 and 7 centuries. Uruk was a city of great prominence, prestige, and revered antiquity. Nebuchadnezzar's appointment as the chief priest of the goddess Inanna was a very important posting in a very important city, one of substantial religious and diplomatic importance. In Sargon's bonus episode, I talked about his remarkable daughter, Enheduanna, the first attributed author in human history. I talked about the strategic importance of Sargon's posting of Enheduanna to be the Antu, or chief priestess to the moon god Nana in the Sumerian city of Ur. You may recall that she was driven from this city by a rebel, and while in exile, she wrote poems of lamentation to the goddess Inanna, and it's these works to which we can attribute her authorship. Inanna is the same goddess that Nebuchadnezzar served more than 1.5 millennia later. Even across 15 centuries, Nebuchadnezzar and Enheduanna were praying to the same goddess and relying on her for patronage and for success in achieving important political agendas. I love the thought of the two of them connected across so much time and space and in such a personal way. So that's my second interesting fact. The third fun new piece of information relates to the perception of Nebuchadnezzar and how that has changed over time. If you've heard of Nebuchadnezzar, it's likely from his appearance in the Hebrew Bible, where he features in several books. In his episode, I discussed the cultural intermingling that occurred during the period called the Babylonian captivity. You will recall that the Babylonian king laid siege to Jerusalem twice, and in the second occurrence sacked the city, razed the sacred temple, captured the upper caste of Judean society, including its rebel king, reallocated the land of the shattered kingdom to the poor and dispossessed, and left town with tens of thousands of captives in tow. I don't want to restate everything I said in his episodes, but it's safe to say that Nebuchadnezzar definitely left a big impression on the chroniclers. This is why he shows up from time to time in these biblical books. But in my episode, I focused on how Nebuchadnezzar is treated in the book of Jeremiah, in which the prophet describes the Babylonian king as an instrument of and acting on behalf of God, who wanted to punish the Judeans for their sins and their lack of piety. The prophet Jeremiah even goes so far as to put words into God's mouth in which the Almighty avows his divestiture of such power into the Babylonian king. One thing I missed, and have since learned more about, was how Nebuchadnezzar was portrayed in other books and the implication that this has had for his legacy and interpretation. In particular, the book of Daniel likewise focuses on Nebuchadnezzar. However, rather than discuss his virtues, or maybe it would be better to say the divine mission that he fulfilled, Daniel paints a different picture entirely. This book, written in the 2nd century BCE, describes a series of events and divine interpretations that took place during the Babylonian captivity. In this book, in particular the first 4 chapters, Nebuchadnezzar comes across as haunted by strange dreams that defy interpretation, portrays him as arrogant, boastful, and cruel, and for a stretch, driven to madness for a period of 7 years. One story describes an instance when Nebuchadnezzar condemns Daniel's companions, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, into a roaring furnace for the crime of refusing to bow down before one of his golden statues. While in the flames, the 3 are untouched, and Nebuchadnezzar can even see a 4th person in the fire. He realizes this mysterious figure to be that of God, and he brings the men out of the furnace, blesses them, praises their God, and hopefully tosses Paul's Boutique on the playlist. Before going further, I want to say that there are a couple things I seek to avoid in this podcast. One is any hint of modern politics. The second is any commentary on religion, including theological discussions. So referencing such sacred books is a delicate matter, and one I want to do with neutrality and respect. That said, the consensus among scholars is that the Book of Daniel is not a trustworthy source in terms of its portrayal of historical figures and events. It was written 4 centuries later than the events it purports to relay. But that has mattered little to the legacy of Nebuchadnezzar, because it seems that, to many, the portrait of the Babylonian king is the one that stuck. For a long time, and I mean a long time, the guy has suffered from a poor reputation in a wide swath of the popular imagination. The portrayal of the Babylonian king held by many has been one of pride and arrogance, punctuated with bouts of insanity. This is in large measure due to the portrayal of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel, which definitely skewed people against him and planted the seeds of such discontent. One article that I read in preparing for this episode, which was written in 1899, simply said, quote, Nebuchadnezzar was cruel. Nebuchadnezzar was pompous, close quote. But then the article goes on to say that he was less cruel and less pompous than other rulers of his time and place, and his kingdom was more peaceful than, say, the Assyrians. The author backs up this claim with evidence by citing inscriptions from his reign that have been recently excavated. And this gets us to the conclusion of point number 3. Thanks in large part to Daniel, a work of historical fiction, the reputation of the greatest Babylonian king was tarnished for a long time. Over the centuries and millennia, most people who know of Nebuchadnezzar knew him from his portrayal in the Bible, but then around the end of the 19th century CE, new archaeological findings began to emerge. New excavations began to provide a different look. The picture that began to come into focus was of a different one indeed, more nuanced, more complicated, more interesting. These finds began to shift the treatment of Nebuchadnezzar in the scholarship, and his reputation, while far from perfect, dramatically improved. The brief quote from the article above is thus evidence of his reputational rehabilitation happening in progress. Today, people seem to think more highly of him now than they have for the past 2 millennia. He seems to be finally breaking free of the unflattering and entirely fictionalized portrayal in Daniel. I don't want to overstate things. Not all scholars from all time have painted an ugly picture of the king, and Daniel wasn't the only source that portrayed Nebuchadnezzar, but it was definitely among the most influential. And Daniel definitely had an impact on Nebuchadnezzar's legacy. Thanks to the new, and when I say new, I'm saying with regards to the long chronology of Near Eastern history, so the last 150 years or so, excavations, interpretations, and scholarship, Nebuchadnezzar is probably better thought of now than he has been for a long time. So that's number 3. After 2 episodes and 1 bonus, I do think of Nebuchadnezzar with a measure of wonder indeed. He was more than a fascinating great. He lived in interesting times, and there's so much to learn. Life is more fun when you keep learning. Thanks for letting me share this with you, and let's keep learning together. If you're just tuning into the series and you haven't had a chance yet, be sure to go back and listen to the episodes about Nebuchadnezzar the Great, and for that matter, the ones before and after as well. I'm thrilled you found this series. Welcome. Thank you all for listening to this bonus episode. I'm grateful that you did. The series will continue with its regular release, so join us on the next one when we get to know the most famous person in human history, Alexander the Great.